Sonic the Hedgehog is an extremely well-known series, and I fully believe that the reason Sonic has half the fame that he does comes from the amazing designs of the titular Hedgehog himself and his supporting cast. It's almost impossible to find an article about iconic video game characters without seeing this guy on the list, but these characters didn't always look like this, and many of this series' most iconic designs had a lot of changes made before the final look we know today was ever even a thing. So in this video, I aim to cover the beta designs of the Sonic the Hedgehog series to really showcase what could have been and the progression to the final design. With that said though, before we get into it, I do want to give a humongous shout out to the Sonic the Hedgehog wiki where all of my information for this video is coming from, so humongous shout out to them. So without any further ado, let's hop right in. Beginning with where it all started, Sonic the Hedgehog. We all know the story. Sega wanted to be a competitor to Nintendo, so they needed a mascot. Basically something to replace Alex Kidd. And after some scrap designs, they eventually came around to a hedgehog design. But these early sketches are a good bit different than the final design in many ways. One scrapped idea that sticks out to me a lot is this sketch of Sonic with a bow tie on. While I'm very glad they didn't go with this, I have such a soft spot for this look. Despite it lacking pretty much like all the coolness that Sonic is even known for, it really does embody the whole Mr. Hedgehog thing a lot of the early concept art was going for. It's such a goofy concept and I can't help but love it. Apart from the bow tie, most all the concept art isn't that much different than the final design. One of the few differences is Sonic having a teal color instead of a darker blue. Once again, I am glad I can say the final is better, but teal in this context does have a certain appeal to it. Another thing you see in almost all the concept art is Sonic had way more quills than he does in the final. While yeah, it does look more like a hedgehog, it does come at the sacrifice of the 3-quill silhouette that people will not shut up about on Twitter, which makes the design far less striking. I also find it very odd that there's this one colored sketch where Sonic has white shoes, and honestly, this literally just has to be a mistake, because apart from this one single sketch, there is no other concept art or anything featuring these white shoes. And yeah, that's pretty much it for Sonic's creation and evolution design-wise. While it is cool to see what could have been Sonic the Hedgehog, or I guess Mr. Hedgehog in this case, I really don't miss anything these designs had to offer. Before moving on, I do want to mention this Eggman concept art. Now, this art comes before he was even the antagonist of the series and was still one of the mascot character ideas. So this art features him wearing pajamas and holding some sort of like pillow. I guess that's a pillow. Well, like, obviously this does not work for the antagonist of a series at all. I do kind of hate that this design is never even, like, referenced. Looking at you, Sonic Boom. While Sonic 2 has a ton of concept art when it comes to stages, badniks, and technical documents, it really doesn't have that much when it comes to characters. But with Sonic 2 having a lot more characters than the first game, there is still a good bit to talk about. So let's begin with Sonic's buddy and or sidekick added in this game, Boomer the Turtle. So before Tails was even a thing, they had this idea of a turtle being Sonic's sidekick, where instead of it being a flying character, this character would presumably use Sonic's speed to glide over obstacles on the ground like spikes, lava, and water, just generally any obstacle. I will say, this design kinda sucks. I am not a fan of it, and I don't think it works as a companion to Sonic, but the like gliding over obstacles using like Sonic's speed is such a cool idea, actually. I would really love to see this realized in a game at some point. I feel like this would lead to some like insane speedrun tech if they went this route. Like seriously, people would go insane with this. But back to the design, it really just feels generic. Nothing about this is iconic. It doesn't look like that bad per se, but it just feels like a background character through and through. Now, this isn't concept art, but in the IDW Sonic 30th Anniversary comic, Sonic Learns to Drive, which is a really fun read, you should go check it out, does happen to feature a fully in-color illustration of Boomer the Turtle in the background of this panel. This is probably pretty accurate to what Boomer would have looked like if he ever was colored, but we can't say 100% that this is the original concept realized. So moving on from whatever that guy is, we get to the actual sidekick for Sonic, Tails. And I'm kind of shocked to say that this is almost the exact same as the finalized design, apart from his legs being non-existent for some reason. One thing I find interesting about this is the buckle on Tails' sock is, I guess that's how you'd say it? I legitimately never noticed this was a part of his design in the classics. Heck, on the American box art, it's not even like on the side, it's right in the middle on the front. Outside of me being blind and the proportions being a bit off, Tails has pretty much just looked like he always has. With that said, I do want to mention a very common misconception about Tails' early design. There's this idea that at one point Tails had blue shoes, which just isn't true in the slightest. Yasushi, Tails' original artist, said himself on Twitter that this image is not colored correctly and that Tails he's always had the red shoes. Moving on to Sonic CD, and with this game came 2 new additions to the cast, Metal Sonic and Amy Rose. So we've got some new characters to discuss, starting with Metal Sonic. In these early designs of Metal, there's a lot of stuff I want to point out. First of which is the very awkwardly tall muzzle. I'm gonna keep it a buck with y'all, this looks really goofy. Very glad they fixed the proportions on that in the final design, because this tall muzzle is in a lot of the concept art for some weird reason. There's also this page and a few others that feature an almost shelf-like design for the quills, instead of the iconic triangle silhouette we see nowadays. There's also this other sketch that has an attribute about it that's completely unique to it. It's that Metal Sonic actually has 3 jets, 2 on the head and 1 in the chest we're used to. Well, I think this could have been better than the final design if it was just 1 on the head. Having 2 jet thrusters on the back of the head is crazy overkill. Next up is Amy, and she is entirely unchanged, but we at least get to see a character sheet going over all her proportions and some cool sketches. Honestly, not too much to say, it's pretty much just more basic Amy art. Before capping off Sonic CD, we do have this one piece of concept art with Eggman that looks pretty interesting. Oh my gosh, I hate it. Oh, I hate it. With Sonic 3 and Knuckles, we have Knuckles for anyone with dyslexia. Unlike Tails and Amy, we now have some actual scrap designs for Knuckles. And from what I can tell, he was originally a mole. It had a much higher focus on his digging ability due to that. Heck, we even get to see this one doodle with him having a shovel with him. The gloves also had a much more complex design, featuring these black pads, is I guess what they are, and him actually having 3 knuckles instead of just 2 like we're used to on this one concept. He's also rocking these sick goggles, which once again fits with the whole digging theme he had originally. With all that said, there's also this black cat for some reason. Not really sure why though, it's there. Overall, while the mole digging idea is kinda cool on paper, I feel like this would not work very well in a classic Sonic game, and these designs pale in comparison to the final, extremely iconic Knuckles. Although I'm still kinda on board with that shovel, I'm sorry, that goes crazy. With that said, that wraps up the main 4 classic Sonic games, and then we have Sonic's really weird era in the 90s, Extreme falling through, and then 3D Blast being 3D Blast, but we're finally now to the next proper Sonic platformer, Sonic Adventure. With Sonic Adventure came not just the introduction to proper 3D in a Sonic game, Sonic and the cast also received full redesigns, and 2 new playable characters were added to the cast, Big and E102 Gamma. Starting off with the main man himself, Sonic. With Sonic Adventure having redesigns, Sega held a contest to decide what Sonic's new look would be. And while out of these 4 contestants it's pretty obvious who won, I'm still a big fan of this one on the top left, drawn by Satoshi Akano. The big thick lines and elf-like shoes have a unique style to them that just works really well in this case. 4 and 3 at the bottom though, yeah, no, these look pretty bad, I'm gonna be honest. The spiky teeth look awful, and these poses are pretty, yeah, I don't know what they were trying to cook here. Overall, I'm glad I can say once again the final design is by far the best, and really launched Sonic into a new era amazingly. As for for the rest of the cast redesigns, there really isn't much giving different design ideas. We do have this sketch of how to draw Knuckles and Amy, and that's about it. Except for Eggman. For some strange reason, there is this singular piece of art with an Eggman redesign that goes for a much more realistic look. Even has a mech arm for some reason, which I'm not sure where that came from, while the one they ended up using for the series onward is much better. I still like this look. It more fits the character of kind of like Sat AM Eggman more than the Eggman of the games. That's really what I get from this. This Eggman feels like a true like dictator trying to take over like the entire Earth, and it's not just like fat man wants to build amusement park, you know? It's much more intimidating in nature, which once again, glad they didn't go with this, but hey, it's still kind of cool. So now on to the new characters, Big and E102 Gamma, and there is a good bit to discuss with these two. Starting with Big, there were a lot of designs thrown around for this guy, and with mostly just changes to how his head looks. I am a pretty big fan of this one though. Really like the black stripes, and the eyes do look much more like a cat than the final design. I'm glad they made his head smaller later on though. It's like way too big, what the heck. One more for Big here, and it's almost the exact same as the final, apart from like, once again, his head being way bigger. The ears are also quite small, and he has 2 belts instead of 1. Overall, good changes because this look is a little bit off-putting. Next up is E102 Gamma. We have a few concepts to discuss here, with these being much more varied than Big, just because Gamma is an Eggman robot. To start off, we have this, which looks way more like a classic Eggman robot, with him having a, you know, it kinda looks like a top hat in the general proportions being a lot more goofy. It doesn't look like bad per se, but it does not fit the style of Sonic Adventure or the other character designs at all. After this, we have this sketch, which straight up just looks like one of the Egg Robos from Sonic 3 compared to like all these other ones. This is by far the closest to just a straight up classic design. While once again, this does not fit the adventure art style or the theming that well, it would look really well in the classics with it having that Egg Robo design I just mentioned. Also, having the 2 gun hands is pretty sick, all things considered. Next up is whatever on earth this is. Yeah, I'm not a fan of this really. Not sure what it would look like from the side, but I don't know. I like to imagine that it just kind of looks like a mailbox. I know this is meant to be like a cylinder, I'm so sure, but it's just kind of funny to just think it's just like a mailbox. What was done right here though is him having the longer legs, and his eyes look much better now. For the final Beta Gamma design, we have this. And man, it's kind of shocking how long they kept the head as an almost perfect sphere. Glad they didn't stick with that in the end. Apart from like the legs having more mechanical parts on them and the head having a more like elongated shape, this does have all the general puzzle pieces of the final design. So I do see how they went from this design to the final one. So that about wraps it up for Sonic Adventure. Now on to the sequel, Sonic Adventure 2. With Adventure 2 came once again 2 new characters to the playable cast, Shadow and Rouge. Shadow has by far the most to discuss, so let's begin there. Starting off with by far the most famous beta Shadow design, Terios. Heck, this design is so popular, it literally got added into Shadow Generations. That is still a crazy thing to think about. While this design does work really well for like a proper Sonic doppelganger, it doesn't really work for what Shadow is in the final game, nor does it like even look that good in all honesty. Everything being like the exact same dark navy makes the design have like 0 contrast, making any pose hard to read without some crazy good shading. And in a game as old as Adventure 2, you would not be able to read this design like at all. I'm a much bigger fan of almost all the other beta designs for Shadow. Next up, we have these 3 Shadow designs that I'm gonna kind of group together. First is the second version of Terios with a visor over his eyes. While the visor looks a little silly, I do like the new colors on the gloves and shoes. Adds much more contrast than the other Terios look. This one actually has a piece of in-motion art. The only change here is the visor is now clear instead of yellow tinted. I assume the visor's still there since you like can't see his eyes at all. Maybe it's just off screen, I don't know. I assume the visor is still there, it looks like it to me. After that, we have this new look featuring a completely different quill shape and a lack of a golden scar. This design is also the first time we get to see the concepts of stripes on the quills that the final design has. We also had this like weird notch taken out of like the stomach like lighter area idea for some reason. Apart from the final design, this is a solid second. I really like it actually. There's even this fully colored art of this design, and in motion, this shadow design really works. Like seriously, if they went with this, I would not be mad. This looks kind of sick, honestly. Next, we have the exact same thing, and it's a straight up recolor, but it does keep the red cuffs. He also has this really weird metal Sonic type of eye. Yeah, this is by far the worst Shadow concept, I'll be honest. This looks pretty bad. But yeah, outside of some sketches for Shadow that feature him wearing this cloak thingy, that's pretty much it for Shadow. On to Rouge. With Rouge, the concept of a bat jewel thief is very clear right from the start. We even have this sketch of her holding a bag full of something stolen, I'm sure. And honestly, I'm glad they scrapped almost all the ideas in these concepts. She looks nothing like a government spy, and it just doesn't look appealing. Like, these just don't look that good, I'll be honest with you. I'll just flash these sketches up on screen because they aren't really that different. I will mention this, quote, cowgirl design, I guess is what you'd call it. Once again, I don't really vibe with it. It's just really overkill. There's just too much going on. The last thing I have to mention for Adventure 2 is this one-off sketch of Gerald. Him having like a proper beard is actually a really cool look. Although I'm glad they didn't go with this because it really just does not make him look related to Eggman like at all. With the classics and adventure games covered, things get a little bit more rocky from this point onward, and there isn't as much or any concept art in a lot of these games to even talk about at all, so I will be skipping around a little to make up for that. Next up, we don't have Sonic Heroes or Shadow of 5, it is straight to Sonic Rush. So with Sonic Rush, there is really only one character to discuss, that being Blaze. And for most characters, it's really interesting to see where it all began. Not the case with Blaze though, it seems. Goodness gracious, what even is this? I'm sure it was just thrown together quickly to get a general idea of what she would look like, but goodness, this looks awful, what on earth? Her being entirely like just black with like weird like outline shading just looks weird. Thankfully, after this point, we do get some actual decent concepts. Most of these go for a much more tribal design. It makes me wonder if the Soul Empire would be less of a high class, like royalty and all this society, and would be more like the Knuckles clan. Either way, these sketches are pretty cool and lean into her fire powers much more than the final design. To be honest, a lot of these kind of remind me, like particularly at the bottom left here, it really reminds me of almost some like Fire Nation type outfit, and I love that to death. That's awesome. There's also this one sketch which is pretty similar to some of the other ones, but with some mild differences like the shoes. But to cap off Sonic Rush, we do have this render of Blaze wearing this cool cape thing, which according to the Sonic Wiki, and I think I'm making a good connection here, apparently she was supposed to wear a cape to hide her flames because she was teased. I assume this is like some Tails thing, like being made fun of, I guess. I don't know if this is like exact perfect connection or not, but still, it's pretty cool. Next up comes Sonic 06. And with 06 came Silver the Hedgehog. And this guy has some of the most variety and ideas out of anything we've covered so far. Heck, they even came up with over 50 concepts for what he could look like. Although we do only have a fraction of these, you can still get a grasp of what they were going for. Starting off with this sketch, and man, they were going all in with the future theme. It really makes me wonder if Crisis City would have been a more futuristic destroyed city instead of the final game's just kind of normal city. After that, we have this design with even more futuristic crap going on. This design actually has a name too, Venice. This version of the character wasn't even a hedgehog yet, he's actually supposed to be a mink, which I'm very glad they changed. This design is super clunky and he has way too much going on. Glad Sonic Team decided that this mink design would just not fit well with the rest of the cast. Next, there's this concept mainly featuring a headband, which looks to double as a visor of sorts? How is this the second time we've had one of these concepts with a visor? With this one, I still believe this is meant to be a mink due to the crazy amount of quills. Once again, glad they ended up toning down the quills in the end, because it's just way too much to look at once again. And I'm sure it would look pretty awful from a gameplay perspective, like look how many quills there are, like that would just not look good from the third person perspective. But with that said, I do kind of like the shoes. They have this sort of like, I don't even know what you call it, like grippy look, like it looks like futuristic like wall climbing shoes, I guess, like on that Black Ops 2 gloves grind, I don't flippin' know. Now with the next concept, we take a huge leap and see a design far closer to the final than anything before this point. And honestly, apart from the chest fur being worse, I kinda like this more than the final design. Hot take, I've never really been a big fan of Silver's boots. They don't look bad or anything, but these are way cooler, I gotta be honest. But the main purpose of this sketch isn't even about the design. It's actually about the idea that his telekinesis would cause his forehead quills to stick upward instead of them just kind of always being like that. And for the final Silver concept, we've got this. I'll say the brown fur does not look good, and the gray shoes are, they're too. The fully teal eyes, though, are a really interesting idea. I really like that. He also has this really big tail in this one sketch, like it's like kind of awkwardly large. There's also a fully rendered version of this design with some changes that make it look a little better, honestly. Like the chest fur being orange, his gloves being white instead of the gray. While I do think the colored fur is still pretty ugly even when the color's nicer, it is nice to see a proper render of this concept. So that wraps it up for Silver and this game pretty much. Now on to Sonic Riders. With Sonic Riders came a lot of new characters, Jet, Wave, and Storm, but the only concept art we have is just for Jet. With Jet's early concepts, he doesn't even look like a hawk at all, like not in the slightest. The tail, the ears, the lack of feathers make him look like some sort of cat of some kind, I won't lie. But apart from those two features, this design is shockingly true to the final design. Okay, so now we just have a worse looking Tails. Yeah, this design is pretty bad, I'm gonna be honest. There's not really much iconic about these two. I hate to say it, but this just feels like a Sonic OC more than an actual character. Like, yeah, I know OC means original character, but you know what I mean. This doesn't feel like official. This feels like some fan-made thing. Thankfully, though, we do get some much better concepts after this point onward. With this next design, he actually looks like a bird now, but that does come at the sacrifice of some of the normal Sonic character traits, like gloves and pretty normal sneakers or boots, which does make this design not looking like nearly as good as the final. But this is much better than the last two by far. There's also an alternate of this with the goggles on, and yeah, this design isn't half bad. Once again, glad they added the gloves and better shoes, but if they did go with this, then I wouldn't mind it, to be real honest. And yeah, that's already it for Sonic Riders. There's shockingly little to talk about with this game, which sucks, with 2 more characters being added with like no concept art. Now on to Sonic and the Secret Rings, and with this game we actually have some humanoid designs to discuss, starting with the main companion to Sonic in this game, Shara. Now most of the concept art for Shara is the exact same as the final 4, but we do have this concept in which that is not the case. And while I don't hate this design, I don't think it fits the genie type of character at all. Honestly, this feels much more like a design for a fairy of some kind, I'll be real honest. I think it's like the hair being like it is that just makes it, and like the kind of elf ears, like I don't know, this does not feel like a genie to me. Outside of that, it's just not that striking. Shara is much more iconic and easy to recognize than this by a long shot. After Shara, we have Eraser Jin, and what is this? I do get that this would fit the vibe of the game, but I'm very glad this was scrapped. The red skin, there being way too much jewelry on him, and it just being genie but super evil. Pretty much anything that's worth praising about this design ended up being in the final design. Very thankful they didn't go this direction. And yeah, that really about caps off Secret Rings, apart from some random concept art like this one of King Solomon, which is much more blatant about its inspiration. That's really about it. And with secret rings, that marks the end of beta character designs for a long time. There's nothing in Rider Zero Gravity, there's nothing in Rush Adventure, nothing in Black Knight really worth discussing. There is concept art, but very little of it. Nothing in Unleashed, Colors, Generations, or even Lost World. So, you know where we're going. Next up is Sonic Forces. And with Sonic Forces, we have 2 new additions to the cast, truly only one, but there's the Avatar and Infinite. And the Avatar does actually have some concept art. We get to see, all these different looks the Avatar could have at one point, and that's pretty cool, but truthfully, let's get on to the main guy of this game, Infinite. And dude, Infinite started off as they were trying to make him mad scary. Look at this dude. Oh my gosh. I know that this video, I'm not beating the Forces guy allegations after this point, because dude, these designs for Infinite look so cool. They're so interesting to me. So like I said, starting off with this design, he almost looks like a ghost of some kind with these weird purple eyes and the cyan dull pupils. Well, of course, I'm glad they didn't go with this. It's still interesting to see the kind of concepts they were making here. With this design, it also highlights how different the Phantom Ruby shapes could have been, because this doesn't even look it looks nothing like the pyramid-like shape of the final game. It has this star type of design, which I'm glad they didn't go with, but it's still very interesting. On to the next design, we still keep a similar-ish theme. All of these have this idea of him having a mask or some sort of covering or clothing or whatever. And this one, it's this looks like some piece of armor. He's got bull horns on it, and I guess that's hair, right? And why is it pitch black? This looks like some creepypasta character. What on earth? But while this type of direction for the design is a little crazy, this does look pretty stupid, all things considered. It does not look good this way. After those concepts, we make a huge jump to where every design after this point is pretty much just iterations of the same concept format. They're using the same template image, but they're changing the design to have different accent colors and different masks shapes, starting with this one, which features a gray, yellow, and white mask with purple sports tape. What I do find interesting is that this design, instead of it having the more triangular design of the final, this almost looks like a bird's beak in a way. It's much more curved instead of pointed, which has its own unique charm to it. I really like what they're going for here. Also, the sports tape, or I guess that's what you'd call it, being a replacement for what would be Infinite's hair, is a really cool look, and I think the purple, yellow, white, and gray is a really nice combo. Before moving on, I do want to mention one thing that this concept does that I think is really interesting. It's that his tail would actually do stuff. Straight up. I don't know if this was direct, but I swear this is where IDW's Tangle came from, because it's literally the exact same thing. Quite literally the exact same concept. And Infinite having sort of a hand tail is honestly such a fun idea. I wish they would have gone with that. It would have made fights way more interesting. A boss fight could have been really cool utilizing this stuff. I really do not know why they didn't go with that. After that, we have this design, which is very different, but also very not different at the same time. It still features the same sports tape in general proportions, but the shoes are way more detailed now. The mask has its more conal, triangular shape that I was mentioning earlier, and there are far less bandages on the back of his head. And I will just go ahead and say it right now. This design is absolutely my favorite out of all the beta designs, and honestly, with some tweaking, I think this would have looked way better than the final design. Straight up, all they needed to do is incorporate his eye properly into this design, because it just looks like he's just wearing a mask that he can't see through for some reason. Maybe that's what, like, the whole, like, the little, like, dots are meant to symbolize, that he can, like, look through it, I guess? I don't know. But if the eye was incorporated into it, this would be this would be better than the final design, I'll be real honest with you. Next up, we have this design, and it by far is the closest to the final in terms of the mask. This is basically what the final game had. I find it interesting that, like, the gloves, the shoes, and the general outline and the mask is so similar, but the colors and the sports tape, that has always been different in all of them. And it's kind of interesting to see how, like, it almost feels like last minute they decided, oh wait, we got to get rid of these bandages. And I just think it's interesting that that's been like a reoccurring theme in basically all of these. And so that is basically it for Infinite, except this concept. Yeah, I don't even need to explain to you, this just does not look good at all. And so, having said all of that, that wraps it up for all the designs I aim to cover in this video. Now obviously, I was not able to cover every single beta design that exists. I basically just selected the ones that I thought that there was actually enough concepts to see a sort of progression, or if there was a one-off one, I just thought it was interesting enough. So that's really about all I've got to say. If you enjoyed this video, I invite you to subscribe because 2025, it's gonna be crazy. The content is going only up from here, so I invite you to join me along the ride. So, thank you all for watching. I hope that you have an amazing rest of your day. God bless.